For decades, the U.S. has maintained an economic blockade on Cuba. Now, the blockade is loosening, and the small island nation is reopening its embassy in Washington, D.C. Do these changes signify an end to Cold War diplomacy toward Latin America? Or is the shift in U.S. foreign policy a shift toward new strategy only, advancing the same old regional goals? I asked these questions to internationally acclaimed public intellectual and linguist Noam Chomsky. I met Noam in his office at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston, where we spoke about economic war in Latin America. Here's our discussion.
Hi Noam, welcome to the program. So on this discussion of economic war in Latin America, I'm wondering if you can talk about the historic U.S. interests in the region. Many people are familiar with the examples of Chile and the overthrow of democratically elected President Salvador Allende in 1973. Many people are also familiar with the U.S. role in El Salvador, Nicaragua, etc. I'm wondering if you could talk about what the historic U.S. goals in the region have been.
Well, the historic goals go back to the founding of the American Republic. The founding fathers were quite frank about their imperial ambitions, including the most enlightened of them, like Thomas Jefferson. They felt, in the racist terms common in the time, that the superior race of Anglo-Saxons, as they described themselves, had every right to people the hemisphere and remove the inferior people elsewhere. That goes on right through American history. So the great progressive poet Walt Whitman wrote ugly, racist comments, poems and statements about what have poor, miserable Mexicans to do with the future of the human race. We should take over, and so on. So it goes way back. It's the beginning. The first major foreign policy goal beyond the conquest of what we now call the national territory, which was, of course, imperialism. The first one was Cuba. But the U.S. could not conquer Cuba because there was a deterrent. The British, they were the big enemy in the 19th century. They were the powerful force that dominated the world. And John Quincy Adams, the intellectual author of Manifest Destiny, and the great grand strategist, he explained that we can't conquer Cuba now, but over time, he said, Cuba will fall into our laps by the laws of political gravitation, just as an apple falls from the tree, meaning over time we'll become more powerful, Britain will become weaker, and we'll just take over Cuba. And in fact, that's what happened. Through the 19th century, U.S. power increased, British power declined. 1898, the U.S. invaded Cuba to prevent its liberation from Spain. That's called here the liberation of Cuba. And in fact, Cuba remained essentially a colony until 1959. And within months after its independence, the U.S. began to attack Cuba with bombing, invasion, a massive terrorist war run by the Kennedy administration, which has kind of quietly disappeared from history, economic embargo and so on. So that goes back right to the beginning. 1823 is the Monroe Doctrine. Again, John Quincy Adams was basically the intellectual author. It declares that the U.S., in effect, it declares that the U.S. should dominate the hemisphere. Of course, they couldn't do it at the time. The U.S. was much too weak. Britain, even France, were much too strong. But the goal was established. By the late 19th century, it begins to be implemented. The first U.S. invasion of Nicaragua was in 1854. The Navy burned down a town to avenge an insult to Commodore Vanderbilt, the rich American who they said was insulted and so on. And it just goes on from there. Invasion after invasion, intervention after intervention. This is the backyard, they do what we want. It was stated very clearly at the end of the Second World War, when the U.S. was really in a position to dominate the world and understood that. And planners were very clear and explicit about it, and they laid plans for all of the world, and they had plans for Latin America. There was a hemispheric conference called, and of course everybody had to come, in Mexico in February 1945, in which the U.S. imposed what was called an economic charter for the Americas. And the economic charter banned economic nationalism in all its forms. The State Department explained that there's a subversive idea circulating in Latin America called the philosophy of the new nationalism, which believes that the resources of a country should be used for the benefit of its own people. And we have to knock that down. That's them. Now I'll add, the implicit message is the resources of the country belong to American investors. And some made that pretty clear. So George Kennan, who's one of the leading planners and considered a kind of a moderate, simply described the resources of Latin America as our resources. He says if our resources are threatened by irresponsible Latin Americans, then police repression and is a better alternative than freedom and democracy and so on. At the end of the Second World War, the U.S. wanted to break down other imperial systems. The U.S. was in a position of overwhelming dominance. And just like Britain a century earlier, when it was in a position of substantial dominance, it decided that it's a good idea to have what's called free trade. If you know you're going to win, you're in favor of free trade, of course always with reservations. And 1945, the U.S. was in that position, so it wanted to open other regions. The way it's put very altruistically, everything should be open for everyone. What it means in practice is everything should be open to us. So regional systems, imperial systems, should be slowly dismantled so the U.S. could have free entry into them, but with an exception. Henry Stimson, Secretary of War, said that we'll exclude what he called our little region over here, which has never bothered anyone. So there we can have a regional arrangement. So we'll just keep our little region over here, Latin America. And it goes on from there. I mean, but if you ask about the history, yes, correct to the beginning. And it's well known to scholarship that in the post-Stalin era, U.S. run atrocities in our little region over here greatly exceed anything that happened in Eastern Europe.
And fast forwarding to today, the U.S. is thawing, seemingly. It's Cold War era diplomatic relations. They seemingly are thawing the blockade of Cuba, the economic blockade. And I'm wondering what you can say about this change. Is this a change in goals, or are the goals the same and it's a change in strategy?
It's much more significant than that. For the first time in 500 years, Latin America has begun to free itself from external imperial domination. That's something that's happened in the last roughly 10 to 15 years, and it's a very significant development. The typical Latin American country, it's a variation, but the typical Latin American country has been governed by a tiny, Europeanized, mostly white elite, which has no responsibility for the population. These are potentially quite rich countries, but there's enormous misery and suffering and inequality. The elite was oriented towards their external masters. So your capital flowed abroad, luxury imports come in, send your kids to school in, France or United States or wherever. That was the typical structure. Very different, say, from East Asia. One of the reasons East Asia developed and Latin America didn't, though it had many more advantages. That's begun to change. In the last roughly decade or two, the Latin American countries have, first of all, begun to integrate, which is a prerequisite for independence. They've begun to separate themselves from imperial domination, that means the U.S. in the last century or so, and even begun to face some of their quite desperate internal problems with some degree of success. There's regression, failures, but some success. One result is the U.S. is no longer in a position to run Latin America. You can see it very clearly in hemispheric conferences. I mentioned the February 1945 conference. Latin Americans just did what they were told. There wasn't any question about it. 2012, there was a hemispheric conference in Cartagena, Colombia, which is the one remaining more or less U.S. ally. It could not reach any decisions. The reason was the U.S. and Canada were totally isolated on all issues. There were three major issues. One was admission of Cuba into the hemispheric system. The U.S. and Canada refused, everyone else wanted it. The second was decriminalization of drugs. The U.S.-run drug war has a devastating effect in Latin America. The problem is in the United States, not there. The demand is here. Even the supply of guns is here. So if you go to Mexico, it's a monstrosity. Majority of the guns that are collected come from U.S. border states, where you can walk into a store and buy an assault rifle and hand it to your favorite cartel, narco cartel gangster. And it really is having a horrible effect in Latin America. So they want to cut it back in various ways. And the U.S. refuses. Canada refused. There was actually a third issue, though, less salient. The hemispheric countries, other than the United States and Canada, agreed to support Argentina's position on the Malvinas-Falkland War. The U.S. and Canada refused. So it just broke down. Now, the next hemispheric, the contrast to February 45 is pretty dramatic, and it reflects the changes that have taken place. The U.S. recognized that they've got to do something. There was a hemispheric conference in Panama summit, and it was realized that before that the U.S. had to make some kind of gesture that would enable it not to be just thrown out of the hemisphere. So Obama made what the left liberal press calls a noble gesture of helping Cuba come back from its isolation and so on. In fact, it's the U.S. that is isolated, and it had to make some kind of a gesture to keep from being thrown out of the hemisphere altogether. So if we put aside the standard self-glorifying rhetoric here, Obama agreed finally to take some steps towards normalizing relations with Cuba. Some steps. The embargo remains. Bans remain. Cuban scholars cannot go to Harvard when they're invited because they're banned by the U.S. government, and so on. So it's still pretty harsh, but something had to be done. And that's reported here as a grand step forward. The way Obama put it was kind of interesting. He said, for 50 years we've been trying to bring freedom and democracy to Cuba, but our methods have failed so far, so we have to find some other way to achieve our, by definition, noble objectives. Actually, the means that were used were terror, substantial terror, much worse than gets reported, economic blockade condemned by the entire world, hostility of a kind that's ridiculed in most of the world and strongly opposed in Latin America. And now we'll try to find some other ways to achieve the same goals, which have absolutely nothing to do with freedom and democracy. Anybody with eyes open can see that. Just look at the governments the U.S. supports. I mean, this is not even a joke. But those are very important changes. And the U.S. is no longer in a position to control the affairs of Latin America. Of course, it's still very powerful, but can't just control them. There still are coups. It's not over. So just in this millennium, there was an attempted coup in Venezuela in 2002, which was beaten back. The U.S. strongly supported it for the few days of the coup. There was a successful coup in Haiti, weakest country in the hemisphere. In 2004, the United States and France, the traditional torturers of Haiti, along with Canada, simply basically invaded, kidnapped the president, sent him off to Central Africa, refused to allow his political party to participate in elections. That's standard procedure. 2009, there was a military coup in Honduras, threw out the president, who had some moderately progressive proposals. He was thrown out. Practically nobody supported it except Obama, who refused to call it a military coup, which would have meant ending military aid, and gave a kind of an aura of legitimacy to the elections under the coup regime. Very few countries did that. And Honduras quickly became one of the worst horror stories in the hemisphere. There's now much concern about immigration from Honduras. You know, why are people fleeing Honduras? Well, there's some reasons. So that still continues. There's also Paraguay. But it's not like it was. The U.S. just can't move in and overthrow governments. And it's switching to other means, economic means. One of the means is what are called free trade agreements. When a government and its intellectual class describes something in a uniform way, the alarm bells ought to go off. The free trade agreements are not, have nothing, they're not agreements, at least if people are part of their countries, because most people are opposed to them. They're not about free trade. In fact, they're not even about trade at all. If you look at the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, the only accurate words are North American. The agreements have very high protectionist elements in the interests of pharmaceutical corporations, media corporations, and so on. Incredible patent rules, the kind that would have prevented the U.S., say, from developing if they'd ever been instituted. Much of it doesn't even have to do with trade at all. It has to do with investor rights. So the rights of a corporation, let's say, to sue a country because it's taking away future profits, things like that. And in fact, even what's called trade is pretty much a joke. So if you take a look at economists, they'll tell you trade has increased between the U.S. and Mexico. If you mean by that things are moving across borders, yes. But when GM produces parts in Indiana and sends them to Mexico to be assembled and sells the cars in Los Angeles, things do move across borders. But that's interactions within a command economy. It's like in the old Soviet Union, if parts were constructed somewhere in the Urals and sent to Poland for assembly and sold in Leningrad, we didn't call it trade. It isn't. And that's, since corporations are tyrannies, they don't allow you to know what they're doing. The government could find out, but they prefer not to. There's only estimates, but the estimates are that maybe 40 or 50% of the cross-border interactions are internal to command economies. So it's not trade, it's not free trade. It's not, it has very little to do with trade altogether. It's mostly investor rights. And it's not agreements, because people don't agree with it. And the effect is pretty harmful. And NAFTA, for example, is one of those rare trade pacts that's succeeded in harming the populations in all three participating countries. The general populations, not the corporations. They're doing fine. Mexico, for example, has had the practically the slowest growth rate in Latin America since NAFTA was established. What you read in the newspapers, it's an enormous success, you know. But if you look at the figures, it's quite different. The U.S. efforts to impose a free trade agreement for the Americas have so far failed. Free trade, of course, in quotes. There are now massive efforts underway to globalize this, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Transatlantic Partnership. We can't really talk about the details because these things are kept secret from the populations, and of course not secret from the hundreds of corporate lobbyists and lawyers who are writing the details. But they have to be kept secret from the populations, and for good reasons. That was done with NAFTA too. If people find out what's being done, they're not going to like it. So you have to have what's called fast track. That's the big debate now. We have to have Stalinist-style political decisions. If the government does something in secret, then it tells the parliament, you can say yes or no, and of course you have to say yes, and then we say, look, we are a democratic society. That's the debate that's going on right now, both with the Pacific and the Atlantic. Again, it has almost nothing to do with trade in any classical sense. The tariffs are already quite low. Lowering them a little more would have almost no effect. But it's, the bits that have leaked out look like the standard arrangements, which are basically investor rights agreements of, you know, the populations are kind of incidental. They may gain something, they may not. But, and that's the current method of trying to regain as much control as possible over Latin America, but it's going to be hard. For one thing, a lot of their, I should say to the detriment of Latin America, much of their interactions are with China. That's harmful. What it means is that Brazil, say, or Argentina are oriented towards producing primary resources for China and accepting Chinese manufactured goods which undermine their own manufacturing industries. So they are not moving towards developing sustainable economies, but towards a kind of quasi-colonial relationship, which in the long term is quite harmful. Venezuela is an extreme case. They have not made any move towards extricating themselves from the oil-based, primary product-based economy. I think it gets maybe 95% of their income now, and that's in the long term disastrous. So there's plenty of problems in Latin America, but there's also great progress. The fact that they have extricated themselves substantially from imperial domination for the first time literally in 500 years, that's of major significance with all the problems that remain.
One major obstacle is the economic powerhouse Brazil. And Dilma Rousseff was elected into a new term last year. I'm wondering what you make of these changes and Brazil as a continuing obstacle to U.S. goals in Latin America.
Well, Brazil for a century has been described as the phrase that's used is the Colossus of the South, which would be a counterpart to the Colossus of the North, the United States. Now, that has yet to materialize, but potentially Brazil could be a major factor in world affairs, and to some extent it is. Under Lula, Rousseff, Brazil has begun to play a significant role, or attempted to play a significant role in international affairs, and the U.S. doesn't like it. Sometimes it's dramatic. So, for example, a couple of years ago, I think 2010, Brazil and Turkey made a deal with Iran, which would have settled any questions about Iranian nuclear ambitions, whatever you think of those charges. I'll put that aside. But whatever you think about them, this would have settled it. It was an arrangement for Iran to send its low-enriched uranium abroad to Turkey. And in return, the Western powers would provide radioactive isotopes for Iran's medical reactors. That's basically the terms. As soon as that was reached, there was bitter denunciation from Washington and reflexively from the media, which parrot the party line. How can they dare do this? They're undermining our diplomacy, on and on. Actually, the Brazilian foreign minister, a very serious person, Celso Amorim, was irritated enough by this so that he released a letter, a private letter from President Obama to President Lula da Silva, in which Obama had actually recommended this, presumably because he thought Iran would never accept and they'd get a propaganda point. That kind of, passed without very much comment. But this is the kind of intervention in world affairs that the U.S. definitely doesn't want. They're concerned about, the BRICS, of which Brazil is a significant, maybe one of the significant members. And it is part of a kind of a diffusion of power in the world, limited diffusion of power, which is referred to in international foreign affairs discourse as the American decline. That's considered a big problem. You get the journal Foreign Affairs, is America disappearing, American decline. Yeah, it's true. The United States has been declining since 1945. It reached its peak of power in 1945. There's been a steady decline since then. In the recent years, that decline continues and presumably will continue. But the U.S. still remains overwhelmingly the most powerful state in the world. There's no other country that can dream of having 1,000 military bases all over the world, or spend almost as much on the military as the rest of the world combined, carrying out aggression and terror all over the place. We have conflicts with China. A lot of concern about that, but it's off the coast of China, not off the coast of the United States. The United States is a victim of self-inflicted wounds, which are significantly harming the economy and the society in many ways, self-inflicted. But with all that, that's since Reagan, that's the neoliberal policies, comparable to Europe. But even with that, the U.S. remains, in realistic terms, the richest country in the world and has enormous advantages, huge space, internal resources, a homogeneous society, no threatening enemies, so on. So it's still a position of overwhelming power, but not what it was, and particularly with regard to Latin America.
What are you hopeful about in Latin America moving forward?
I think there have been quite hopeful developments in the last 10 or 15 years. Indigenous communities have begun to find a voice for the first time. In the countries with large indigenous populations, like Bolivia and secondarily Ecuador, they've had a substantial role. In Bolivia, they elected their own president. There are plenty of conflicts between indigenous people and the governments that they initially supported, not so clearly now, but that's an important step forward. And that's, in fact, that's a tremendous step forward for the entire world. It's a kind of incredible irony that all over the world, the leading forces in trying to prevent a race to disaster are the indigenous communities. I mean, anyone who's not living under a rock knows that we're facing potential environmental catastrophe, and not in the distant future. All over the world, it's the indigenous communities that are trying to hold it back. First Nations in Canada, indigenous people in Bolivia, Aborigines in Australia, tribal people in India. It's a phenomenon all over the world. Those who we call primitive are trying to save those of us who we call enlightened from total disaster. And it is incredible. I mean, just for example, every day has new evidence. A couple days ago, the IMF came out with a study on subsidies to fossil fuel industries. They estimate that about over $5 trillion a year are given by taxpayers to the industries that are dedicated to destroying human existence. It's pretty remarkable. On the other hand, indigenous communities are trying to stop this suicidal race. So their increase in power is of global significance. And the extrication from imperial domination and beginnings of integration, they do offer hope for steps forward.
Thank you very much for speaking with me, Noam.
Glad to have the chance.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Chris Spanos. For more information about the show, visit our website, amygdala.media.
English vocabulary with pictures, problems, and defects. Number 1. Scratched. This CD is scratched. Another way to say it is there are scratches on the CD. Scratches are marks on the surface. Number 2. Cracked. The CD and the windshield are cracked. Number 3. Smashed. The guitar is smashed. Smashed means completely broken into many pieces. Number 4. Torn. Ripped. The jeans are torn or ripped. Torn and ripped are usually used for fabric or paper. Number 5. Crumpled. The paper is crumpled. This word is typically used only with paper. Number 6. Stained. The shirt is stained. Another way to say it is there is an ink stain on the shirt. Number 7. Chipped. The mug is chipped. This means there is a small piece missing. Number 8. Dented. The car door is dented. This word is used when a piece of metal goes in. Number 9. Bent. The key is bent. The word bent is used when something that should be straight is not straight. Number 10. Burnt. The bread is burnt. The word burnt is used when something was heated too much and turned black. Thanks for watching English Tips from Espresso English. If you liked this video, please share it.